the series and he just doesn't die. But it's an interesting choice for that character in particular. The rest of them, I feel like as long as they sort of somewhat approximate the characters, like I think they're all good casting choices.
So I think the stream paused for a second, but if you could give us a summary of what you just said, Colin.
They all look good. Tom Hopper as Albert Wesker is a little bit odd. Just throw some sunglasses on him; he'll be fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I apologize to the chat and everyone watching at home, but it appears that we are back and everything is fine. And according to Johannes Roberts in a statement, they said, I really wanted to go back to the original first two games and recreate the terrifying, visceral experience I had when I first played them, while at the same time telling a grounded human story about a small, dying American town that feels both relatable and relevant to today's audiences. Wow, that's morbid, isn't it?
So that's the part that's really interesting to me, more so than the casting, is that it's the first two games, which the Resident Evil series has like a surprisingly like concrete, detailed timeline. And the first two games take place like 2 months apart in two like very different locations. Like one's in the mansion, one's in Raccoon City. So it'll be really interesting to see how they sort of like integrate the two. Like maybe they'll just sort of compress the timeline, have like these parallel stories going on. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they tackle that.
And there's a bunch of Resident Evil things. Janet, are you excited? Are you gonna watch this movie?
I think I will just out of like morbid curiosity. I
Yeah.
feel like this, I mean, Resident Evil has like a lot of different lore angles going on, so like it's not like it's ever just been the games. But I don't know, like I'm just interested to see what they do with it. And I think like the thing that has drawn me into Resident Evil, the few games of that series that I've played, which I mostly have played like the more modern Resident Evil games, even like the remake, I would consider that like a modern iteration on like a classic thing. Um, it's the exploration is sort of what draws me into that world, so it'll be interesting like having to experience it in a more passive medium because when you're watching something, you're not an active participant in the same way. But I'm curious as to what they do with it, and I feel like it's the kind of movie that if it's not really that good, I won't really mind it because I just want to see what they do with it. So, and my tolerance for watching like for experiencing like movies that I don't end up loving is like a lot higher than like a game. Because a game is so much more of like a financial and time and like effort investment versus for this, it's like, okay, well, I can kind of just draw these comparisons and just enjoy this lore in a different angle.
Yeah, I have watched a lot of bad movies over the last couple of months, so anything even kind of interesting is good on my book. I don't know, Tom, what do you think?
I think video game movies are bad.
Oh no.
I think that like the quote that he had about what they want to do with it sounds interesting, and the cast that they put out is cool and could be good, and I have absolutely no faith in video game films whatsoever anymore, and all of my hope is dead, and we'll have to see. Like, I genuinely have no way of saying, like, I'm excited for this, because, like, the statistically, it's going to be terrible. Like,
I think
Yeah, but
the
what
one
if this time it's different? What if?
what
What
if
if?
Fair.
What
You
if
got
this is
me.
the
You
different
got me.
time? What if it
I
is?
think I think like the one sort of shining light for this is that like they're actually trying to kind of adapt the game, not like do some weird over the top action movie approximation of whatever they think the video games are and just throw
Mhm.
Mila Jovovich into it.
Yeah,
Um
that's fair.
I didn't mind the first Resident Evil movie. I thought it was interesting enough, but also I was young. I don't know. You're making a cringe face at me, Colin. Don't like. Maybe I have to go back and rewatch it. But anyway, there's like we said, there is a ton of Resident Evil stuff coming out recently. There's also the Resident Evil Netflix series, which is going to tell the original story about Wesker's children after they move into New Raccoon City. And Netflix really can't get enough of zombies because that they are also getting the CGI animated film titled Resident Evil Infinite Darkness as well. Meanwhile, Anderson, who kickstarted the last Resident Evil live action film series, is directing a live action Monster Hunter movie, which is coming out in December. So we're getting a lot of video game movie stuff and adaptations. But onto some more back onto the game side of things. Next gen Wolfenstein, Dishonored, and Prey collections are coming for the Series X and S. The next gen collections of Bethesda's Wolfenstein, Dishonored, and Prey games seem to be headed to the Xbox Series X and S, according to new ESRB ratings. The Xbox Series is listed as the only platform for both ratings, suggesting they could be exclusive to Microsoft consoles following Microsoft's acquisition of ZeniMax, which owns Bethesda. So that's pretty cool. It's interesting.
would be
Are any
wild.
of you? Yeah. Tom, are you a fan of these games? Are you excited?
Yeah, I mean, I'm less a fan of the Wolfenstein games, not because I don't like them, but just because it's not quite as much the series I'm into. I think they're very cool, and people obviously love them for good reason. I'm very excited about the Arcane collection because I think Arcane is so good at making games that no one will ever play and no one understands and they can't market whatsoever, but are just so fun, right? Like, I think Deathloop is a really good example of that. You look at that game and you're like, that looks cool, but also what? And like, probably that game's gonna be great, right? Like, they just are so good at that sort of like weird sort of flavor that they do. I'm also particularly excited that according to these ESRB ratings, that was going to include, it said it would include 4 games, which if we like rack them up would be Dishonored, Dishonored 2, Dishonored Death of the Outsider, which was the standalone DLC sort of thing, and then Prey. And I'm really, really glad that Prey is in there because they very easily could have just done just Dishonored. And like that would have been a disappointment because I think a lot of people skipped Prey, and Prey is super, super, super good. So yeah, I'm really excited that these might be coming. The question of if they might only be coming to Xbox is like, oh man, that would be planting a flag in the ground, I think, on Microsoft's part.
Yeah, I think that is probably the bigger information piece of information to glean from this. But hey, more games on next gen consoles for people who may have missed out on them previously. Janet, are you a fan of Dishonored or Wolfenstein?
I wouldn't say I'm a Wolfenstein fan for a lot of same reasons Tom mentioned. It's not really my style. And the only actually Wolfenstein game I played was the most recent one, which I'm told is the worst of the ones that have been made. So that's an unfortunate lining up of those things. But I did play a little bit of Dishonored. I didn't finish it, so this would be like a nice way to get back into it. And Prey has been on my list for a long time. I believe it was either is a Game Pass game or was a Game Pass game at one point. So it's something I definitely want to check out. And I would really love to see some of these games be Xbox exclusive games. Like, it's just been such, and it's not because I want less people to play them, but like, people have been like clamoring for like Xbox. There's no exclusives. You guys don't have, and they made this big purchase. And I understand that financially they may not do it because you can just sell it in more places. It makes sense. We know like Minecraft isn't like exclusive to Xbox or anything like that. So there's precedent to where they buy things but still let them be on other platforms. And while that's really good for like gamers as a whole, it's also like I want to see them have some exclusives. I want to feel like there's a reason that I play on this console, other than the fact that I like offset thumbsticks. Like, I would just like something more than that to like report back to people. And ultimately, I think the level of competition just makes things more exciting. So that's something I'm really hoping for. And I just see like, I love the idea of this gen, everyone just stirring the pot and going back on everything they said. Like, Xbox is huge on like, we just, it's about like services and like, who needs exclusives? And they're like, we made this giant purchase. And Sony's like, we believe in generations, but also not really. Not really. No, not so much anymore. And everyone's just like, everything's flipped and it's madness. And I live for this chaos. It just makes for more interesting conversations and competition. So I hope that happens. I'll be playing either way because I got both. Like, I got all my bases covered for everything. So maybe that makes me unempathetic, and frankly, I don't mind because it's not that deep of a situation.
It would be, the wild thing to me is that if they do make this Xbox exclusive, these collections, that's going to be a really interesting thing to me because like they have every right to do so, but we then would have cross-platform games becoming next-gen exclusives in like a really weird, interesting way where it's like all these games came out on PlayStation, but not PlayStation 5, right? Like that would be so wild to me.
Especially with Deathloop coming out. Like, it would be such a weird, like, I also think maybe, just from like that level, they wouldn't do it because it'd just be such a weird, like, it's exclusive here, but then it's on the PS5 here, and it just doesn't flow well. But like, how chaotic would it be? Like, how good would that be?
Colin, do you have any thoughts?
One thing I'm really excited about for this is like, this really feels like Microsoft like got done with like sort of the the legwork of acquiring ZeniMax and Bethesda, and we're like, okay, let's do stuff. Let's like start releasing things. Let's get stuff out into the wild. Let's start, putting the $7.5 billion investment to work. And it excites me because like so many of these studios, Arcane in particular, that Microsoft now owns, like it feels like they never really got like a fair shake to sell their games properly. Like they never had super strong marketing pushes, and like other studios like Double Fine, like it feels like they never really got like the proper chance to like sell as many copies of these games as they could have if they had like a big marketing budget behind them. It's like now that Microsoft's in charge, it seems like, oh, Arcane might like actually be able to like sell a lot of copies of games now, like if they're properly sort of put out in front of people. And that's something that excites me. And it seems like, starting with something like a collection, even though it's games that have already been released, like that's exciting. Finally, these are some like really amazing games, and like hopefully more people will be able to get to play them this way.
I do think it's interesting that a big selling point of the next gen consoles are last gen games, but a selling point that isn't really being used as a selling point is the fact that, for example, the Xbox Series X is technically capable of outputting to 8K, but Xbox boss Phil Spencer says he's not sure if 8K will ever be video game standard, which is our next story. Check out that segue. Janet, I know you had some thoughts about this. What do you think about 8K never ever being a standard for at-home video game playing?
I think it sort of says what everyone has already been thinking. I know definitely Tom had mentioned this a lot before we started recording, of how this has been a discussion of like this 8K, even though like the Xbox Series X has the capacity to do this, it's not really going to be something that you may truly experience, or that most people would experience, considering like where everyone's TVs are and where the rest of tech is. And yeah, I think these fringe like high end elements of gaming will like never really be a standardized thing. I think that's why we keep going back to, if you think of other elements of the technological realm of games, we always have the conversation of like PC and consoles, and this idea of like, why are we even talking about these consoles when like PC has been doing this like way ahead? Like when it comes to the mainstream market, it's always like at a little bit of like a lower technological level than what you can do. Just because it's possible to do it doesn't mean that it's going to become standard practice. And I just think it's interesting that like, I guess maybe now we're also approaching a little bit less of the intensive marketing push and a little bit more of like the reality hangover of like, okay, well, like, so we were talking about 8K, but like, it's not really going to be the thing that you're fully experiencing this next generation. And I think it makes sense to start kind of couching that, especially like from Phil Spencer, now that we have units out in the wild and people doing preview coverage, to start making this like a tangible thing and giving like actual examples on how this will play out, or rather how it won't exactly play out.
Tom, you said something kind of funny before we started this about this topic. Would you like to share with the rest of the class?
What specifically? Because I think it's very funny that anyone would think 8K is a real thing anytime soon.
You know, you're catty today.
Yeah.
You're like, 8K is not real. These movies suck.
8K was a marketing buzzword that I understand why they used when they first started announcing the Series X and all its specs, but like, no, there's no world where 8K is realistic anytime soon. And I actually really respect, like, kind of like what Jan was saying, I really appreciate Phil Spencer saying that and being upfront about that, because it makes decent marketing to say the word 8K or 8 words. I don't know. Anyway, the number.
It got me.
Like it makes good marketing, but like it's hard to explain both diminishing returns that would have on current TV sizes, because your pixel density would get so high at that point that a lot of people wouldn't even notice. And also it's hard to explain how crazy difficult 8K is to process, especially in games. Like you gotta understand that resolutions are multiplicatively more difficult to render for games, right? It's not just like, well, 4K is double 4K, so therefore it's twice as hard to render. Like if you do the calculations of those resolutions, there's just over 8 million pixels in 4K, and there's just over 33 million in 8K. So it's like it's, you know, 4 times as hard, more than 4 times as hard because of the way squares scale. And like basically what that means is like I respect Phil Spencer for saying this, and I think he's right that yeah, technology is going to keep getting better. Everything is going to keep getting better forever because that's just the way technology works. Is it's explosive growth. But like, it's not a thing anybody has to worry about anytime soon. When they're already still at the point where like modern consoles and next gen consoles are like questioning whether they can hit 4K 60 still. So to be able to be like, now we're thinking about 8K, it's like just way too premature, right? Like, so I welcome back, Colin. So I respect Phil Spencer for kind of being upfront about it, and I think it will eventually probably be a more common thing, but like he said, not anytime soon. And I don't think anybody has to cry over that. I don't think anybody should be like feel like we're missing out on something because of that.
Michael from our YouTube chat said 8K is pointless unless you sit 20 feet away from a huge TV. Is that about it?
That's
about the
I mean
sum?
that's part of it, right? Like if you have a 50-inch TV that's 4K, like you're already kind of like bumping up against like sort of how much you can see sitting 10 feet away on a couch or whatever. So if you put just 8K on a 450-inch TV, just the same, like it would be hard for a lot of the time it would be hard to notice in tangible ways. Not saying it wouldn't be better or whatever. It's just like you start to get diminishing returns on the current screen tech that we have.
So Clarity Golden in YouTube chat says Tom doesn't deserve 8K, but
I mean that's true. I'll own that.
so
you do.
we originally got this quote from an interview with Wired, and in that chat, Liz Hamron, the head of gaming engineering at Xbox, also said Microsoft's data suggests that 4K TV adoption is actually less than what publishers may think. And so that suggests 8K adoption is even still years away from that, at least. Colin, do you have a 4K TV? Are you interested in keeping up with the best of the best as soon as it's available?
I do have a 4K TV. When it comes to that technology, I'm not a super early adopter because you're going to waste a lot of money being a super early adopter on TVs. And I don't anticipate myself getting either a new 4K or an 8K TV like anytime soon. I think we're basically not going to see any sort of 8K stuff this generation. I think if we have like a mid console upgrade like we did last generation, like I think there's a good chance that we could see those consoles like a few years from now being more capable of it. But even then, it's a technology that's like it takes so much power to render stuff at that resolution that like I don't even know if I see the mid consoles doing that. So long answer short, no, I'm gonna stick with my old TV for a while.
Yeah.
You know what we're gonna see this generation that's gonna have 8K in like 3 or 4 years is we're gonna see some like really, really beautiful nature documentary that somebody filmed in 8K and was like, here you go, world. And like only people with fiber internet are gonna be able to stream it. And only people with 8K, like the 3 people with 8K TVs are gonna be able to appreciate it.
I think the first thing we're gonna see in 8K is Minecraft. 'Cause that's always like
Yeah.
that's always like for some reason
The harbinger.
thrown on display for like graphical fidelity. Like check this out, and I'm like, I don't really know what I'm seeing here, but I like the animals, so sure.
Doing that. I think when we upgraded to a 4K HDR TV in the IGN office, and the first thing that was put on it was nature documentaries. So I think that's basically it. It's nature documentaries. We're gonna go see the most beautiful, detailed lizard in our lives, and that's just going to just encourage
board.
us to go get a really big, nice 8K TV. And maybe they will come out with a PS5 Pro that'll be twice the size and be very large. And you know
God.
what else are very large is monsters. And we got some news about Monster Hunter Rise today because I was able to interview producer Ryozo Sugimoto and director Yasunori Ichinose about the game, and I am very excited. I killed Tom. I'm sorry. I broke
No,
him.
it's okay. It was good. It was a good segue.
Hey.
Casey, the queen of transitions.
I tried. I made an attempt. But in this interview, we did learn a lot of interesting details that I think are probably more interesting to Monster Hunter fans, but we did learn some kind of big picture things as well. Man, Tom, do you want to start? What do you think was the most interesting you learned from these interviews?
You definitely the stuff that you pulled out from that interview like definitely was really interesting, especially for Monster Hunter players. The thing that jumped out to me was one of the first things you told me, which was that everyone saw the climbing on walls and all this sort of like verticality movement and was like, oh wow, they really took inspiration from Breath of the Wild, like so many games are doing right now. And apparently that wasn't the case. They you asked them if it was inspired by Breath of the Wild, and they were like, no, we've just sort of always wanted to do this. And that's that's very weird and unexpected, but also pretty cool.
Yeah, they laughed when I asked, so I'm wondering if they laughed because so many other people were asking them that, and they're like, "Oh my god." But I also saw in the comments that it's like, "Why are you comparing that to Breath of the Wild?" I mean, come on, you're climbing walls, going all over the place, having freedom of movement. I feel like that is a very Breath of the Wild thing. But yeah, Tom, you're right. They said they've been they wanted to make better freedom of movement for a Monster Hunter game since the completion of Monster Hunter Generations. And I think this could be seen even as far back as Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, where verticality played a huge role in the levels. And now in Monster Hunter Rise, they said that even just traversing around the game will be super fun. And I mean, it looks like it. You have a basically grappling hook attached to a bug called the wire bug that can just attach to the air, and you can just swing around and go wherever you want. It looks like a lot of fun to me. But I think another big piece of news is that so before we got Generations, which was almost like it's not a spin-off, but it was kind of part of the fourth generation of Monster Hunter. I'm getting way into the weeds, guys. Chat, if you want me to stop,
Dig
let
in.
me know.
You
and
just
I will
own it.
stop.
You're our expert.
I'm already
on
in
this.
here. I'm already in.
Then just
But-
you stay there.
So we consider Generations as kind of part of Monster Hunter 4 generation. I say the word generations a lot, but I think everyone knows what I mean. But anyway, Monster Hunter World was the 5th generation of Monster Hunter games, and they said that they are no longer going to be using numbered titles. They think it's a lot easier and better for the audience to understand what the game is about by just using subtitles. And personally, I think it's less intimidating as well to go away from numbered titles, especially when the games are they're all so different. You don't need to have played the other 4 to start playing a new one. Colin, what do you think?
You know what I think happened there? I think Monster Hunter World became Capcom's best-selling game, and
Yes.
they're like, "Yep, no more numbers."
Yep. We're done. We're done with numbers. That actually could have been it.
Yeah, because a Monster Hunter World player isn't going to go back for Monster Hunter 5 as much as they are going to go back for just the next Monster Hunter game, probably.
Monster Hunter World's classic aliens
It's
approach.
never been done before. Like, what if we had some letters? But here's the thing. They either sound exactly as you think they sound or totally different than you think they sound. What if it's the same word but spelled just differently for no reason? Maybe so they don't get sued. I don't know.
The interesting thing is this is a trend across not just Monster Hunter, but like all of gaming right now, right? Is like Doom Eternal, Halo Infinite. Like you have all of these big series that are just dropping numbers and going with sort of subtitle names instead. And I think it makes sense with like now that we're getting to a point where, games are coming out like Final Fantasy 16 and a lot of these series have been around so long, and we're starting to get towards weird, funny situations that nobody likes where you're saying like, oh, was that Prey 2016 or the original Prey? Was that Doom 2016 or
I hate it.
This is Doom 2 2019? Like I'm like nobody wants to do any of that stuff. So like I think developers are sort of skirting around the issue by just like abandoning numbers in a way that I don't mind ultimately.
No, I think it's really smart to get away from that because I mean, video games have now been around for a very long time, and if you have kids coming in at like age 10 who probably didn't play 1, 2, or 3 in a lot of these series and may not want to go straight into 4, so getting rid of those numbers and just giving it a subtitles like, oh, this is a you go into it thinking, at least believing you can go into it without having played the other previous ones. Because I'm definitely one of those people who don't want to jump into like a 5th installment of a game. I don't know, Janet, would you like? Are you that? What do you think?
I just can't help but think in this conversation of how naming conventions are evolving, which I totally generally agree with. And then in this whole grouping, there's the outlier of new Pokemon Snap, where it's like that's not a numbered thing, but it's like something that draws attention to the fact that like this isn't the old game, even though why would I, who thought it was the old game? And they're like, well, now you definitely don't think it's the old game. So it's interesting how like some companies will just directly draw attention to it. I think the thing with Monster Hunter, and Casey, I'd love to hear like what your like take is on this, because you're like the Monster Hunter expert. But like, it's just always a franchise that just seems difficult. Like, I know it for its difficulty, and it's like a long investment. Like, would you say these sort of like sub-series, do they have a different mechanical flavoring in the same, like I think of a series like Forza, where there's Motorsport, which is like hardcore racing sim, and then there's Horizons, where it's like, oh, okay, you can drive a Lamborghini on the sand and you can rewind time and it's all good. Are is there like a difficulty scaling across these different iterations, or are they all like still just fairly challenging?
So one of the things that the producer said was that they make an effort for every Monster Hunter game to feel like a Monster Hunter game. That might sound obvious, but if you come in from a previous Monster Hunter game and try and pick up and play this, it's going to feel similar enough that it doesn't feel alien, because they don't want to alienate fans who are like expecting a Monster Hunter game. But they have continued to improve, to make quality of life improvements to make it easier and more accessible for new players. Like World has probably had one of the best tutorials I have seen in a Monster Hunter, which is why I think so many people were able to get in and why it was so popular. Tom, I know Monster Hunter World was your first Monster Hunter. I mean,
Yeah.
you kind of just went in on your own, right?
Yeah, mostly. Monster Hunter World, I think it felt from an outsider, as someone who, like you said, Janet, was very intimidated by this series. It felt like there was a concerted effort to talk to me as a player who had not played those games before in World. And I think that the vibe I'm getting with Rise, at least, and maybe this is wrong because Monster Hunter has traditionally lived on a Nintendo system a lot. But the vibe is that, to me,
Trying.
is that like they're not going to just like forget that. Like, I think that they found such success by doing that in World, just insane sales numbers compared to anything else the series had seen, that like they're not just going to suddenly go back to, crazy hardcore unfriendly mechanics.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And Monster Hunter Rise was actually being made in tandem for a large part of Monster Hunter World's development. So it is its very own. They really wanted to hammer home that it's very much its own unique thing, but you can also very obviously tell they took a lot of those lessons from Monster Hunter World, as you said. And I really don't see it being more difficult than World. If anything, maybe it'll be even easier for people to get into, but still not be easy, because I'm not suggesting that. Like Monster Hunter will always be a challenging game, and I think that's just very much part of its draw.
Yeah.
However, I think Monster Hunter World did a good job at making the main story accessible enough for most people to be able to finish it without getting really upset, and then made the post games and the event quests and like the behemoth and fatalist and all of these different things the real challenge. But you can finish the story and not have to, you know, slam your head into the wall in frustration at trying to fight these optional things. And I think Monster Hunter's always done a good job at that. And that actually brings me to a point. So right now, for example, Monster Hunter World, you kind of have to be online while these events are active. But in previous Monster Hunter games for the Nintendo systems, because they are portable and you don't have to be online, all of the event quests were downloadable and you could play them offline and locally. So I think that might be the case with Monster Hunter Rise as well, especially because your multiplayer and single player quests are now separated. So I assume you'll be able to pause the game while playing in single player, which is also pretty cool. But there are a lot more details, and I can keep talking about Monster Hunter. I think those are the few biggest things. Oh yeah, Monster Hunter Rise won't have Nintendo voice chat built in.
That's not news anymore, though. That's just the sad truth of the world.
Yeah. And oddly, the weird thing about that is I've seen it's been very divisive between people in the comments whether they care or not. A lot of people are like, "Good, screw integrated voice chat. I never used it anyway. It was toxic." But I play Monster Hunter with my friends. I almost never play Monster Hunter without having PlayStation chat on. But I guess that's the difference between it, if you're chatting with your friends and just, have the chat open to a bunch of randos in a room.
I think too, though, like just with Nintendo specifically, right? Like I mean, you host NVC, like that name is very much a nod to the failings of Nintendo, which is kind of funny to have the Nintendo show based off of like a burn of what Nintendo does poorly. But yeah, I think that's one reason that it's been kind of maybe split where people I imagine most people that are upset are more upset at the principle of it, of the fact that it's just not even there at all, rather than how often it's used. I personally have only dipped into using Nintendo voice chat once out of morbid curiosity during Mario Kart 8, and it was indeed one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my gaming life, where it was just like this staticky sound, and it's like, hello. And also, it was with Mario Kart. It was like one of the first games that they added like the app integration to, and like of all the games, like we're not working together. It's like what am I going to talk to you about? And I didn't know, they didn't know. I turned it off and I'm like, I hope to never see this again. So yeah, I think definitely just voice integration on Nintendo platforms and anything related to online always leads to at least some level of disappointment or lacking in some degree.
Colin, have you ever used built-in Nintendo voice chat?
I've used it once for Animal Crossing, and it was jolly. It's just so weird just having it through your phone instead of just the game.
Yeah.
And it's just like, and it's funny because I did it the night that Animal Crossing came out, and I was with a group of friends from IGN, and we were in a big Discord channel, and it was a bunch of fun. And then I switched over to a different group of friends to do it, and we did it through Nintendo's app instead. And it's just like, man, Discord really is like more effective of a Nintendo voice chat app than Nintendo's like actual app.
This is way off subject now, but since we're on this topic, it's wild to think about the beginning of the Switch's life when you had things like Reggie, who I love and respect very much, kitty cat, where you had people like Reggie being like, this voice chat app on your phone will be better because you don't want to deal with your gaming headset while you're out playing on the train. And everyone was like, what? Now we have to deal with this phone app. And it's like terrible. And there are games like Fortnite and Warframe, which have voice chat built in through the system if you just plug in a headset that works. But then Nintendo just straight up pretends that's not a thing for every game. It goes, la, 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 we can't. And anyone brings it up. Like, I just don't get it. Like, if you don't want to use voice chat in Monster Hunter, that's fine. I understand that. More power to you. But the fact that it's just like a hassle that doesn't even give you an option and doesn't exist, but does somewhere, but doesn't also, like, it's so annoying.
Yeah, it is. And I really hope that the online multiplayer in Monster Hunter Rise will be as easy as the fixed version of Monster Hunter World multiplayer, because I know we ran into some problems when it first came out, but within the first month or two, Capcom had fixed it, and now it's so seamless and so easy. But one of the things that I think RX confirmed in one of his interviews is that the hub spaces will be limited to 4 people instead of 16, which is disappointing, but whatever. But with that, I think that is all the time we have left for news, games, and more. I hope you all enjoyed us indulging in this Monster Hunter news. And of course, you can always get more Monster Hunter news on IGN.com and everything else that we talked about. Colin, Janet, and Tom, thank you so much for being here with me to talk about news, games, and more. We will see you right here in the same place and the same time tomorrow.